Antoninus Pius is one of the greatest Roman emperors no one has heard about. The sources just are not there. The main thing that's remembered about Antoninus Pius is that he was responsible for the rearing of his far more famous successor, Marcus Aurelius. Marcus was already a teenager when Antoninus took over. The young Marcus was totally unimpressed with Hadrian, but he deeply loved Antoninus Pius. And Antoninus Pius, as we'll see today, rapidly promoted Marcus as his main successor, but Hadrian had also named Lucius Verus to the succession plan. Antoninus Pius is known as a loyal emperor, and yet did the fact that he favored Marcus Aurelius so heavily create problems when he died? After all, Rome had never had multiple emperors in a time of peace. This was always a harbinger of civil war. Was Antoninus Pius faithful to the succession plans of Hadrian? How was Marcus Aurelius prepared to rule the Roman Empire? We'll talk about these things in this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 48, The Early Life of Marcus Aurelius. Antoninus Pius is one of the longest reigning Roman emperors in all of imperial history, let alone in the Pax Romana. And yet we know so very little about his reign because the sources are so fragmentary. They just don't survive. But it is during the reign of Antoninus Pius that one of Rome's most famous emperors was prepared for power. His name was Marcus Aurelius. Now, unfortunately, because Marcus's early life occurred during Antoninus Pius's reign, we only have some details. But what I'd like to do today is to try to reconstruct Marcus's childhood and early career in preparation for future events which we know much more about once Marcus officially became emperor. When Antoninus Pius took over in AD 138, Marcus was in his late teens. And as you know from previous episodes, he was very much favored by the emperor Hadrian. Marcus probably spent a lot of time with the men of Hadrian's family and his close friends because he lost his father when he was a small child. Marcus's father was a praetor, probably would have risen even further in the ranks, but for his untimely death, and we don't know how he died. Hadrian thought very highly of the teenage Marcus, giving him the nickname Verissimus, the most true. He really loved Marcus as a grandson. But Marcus, in turn, did not think very highly of Hadrian. At least that's what it seems. Hadrian was, near the end of his life, a bit cracked. He had always had a terrible relationship with the Senate, and it sounds like Hadrian was interested in executing some members of the Senate just before he died, and those orders were not carried out by Antoninus Pius. That supposedly is one reason why Antoninus Pius was given the name Pius. Marcus saw Hadrian's bad behavior and probably did not wish to emulate it. We know from Marcus's meditations, which he wrote near the end of his life, that Marcus admired the men in his life who were calm, dispassionate, thoughtful, well-reasoned, willing to listen to people, willing to be humble, and Hadrian is conspicuously absent in Book 1 of the Meditations, which is the place where Marcus thanks the many positive influences on his life. Not a single word about Hadrian. But Marcus really loved Hadrian's successor and his adoptive father, Antoninus Pius. The notes of gratitude in Book 1 of the Meditations are usually quite short, but the one about Antoninus Pius is almost a short essay. He thanks the emperor for so many life lessons. I won't summarize them all because it's very, very long. But essentially, he praises Antoninus Pius for being mild, constant, a man of great perseverance, a man capable of overcoming bad habits. Antoninus Pius was, according to Marcus, not pretentious. He was humble, careful, and generally a happy and satisfied man. Marcus's evaluation of Antoninus Pius may be true. It may be exaggerated, but the fragmentary sources that we do have also corroborate this. It's from Cassius Dio, for example, that we get the account of Antoninus Pius refusing to carry out the orders of Hadrian to have several senators executed, although almost nothing else of Cassius Dio's thoughts on Antoninus Pius survive. We also have a much later biography, which is typically thought to be quite unreliable, but nevertheless, it does praise Antoninus Pius profusely. Antoninus Pius rapidly promoted Marcus Aurelius. In AD 140, when Marcus was 19 years old, Antoninus Pius made him consul. As you know, this is the highest office in the old Roman Republic. It was by this point largely a symbolic office because equestrians held increasingly more authority in the Roman Empire. And you typically needed to be at least in your 30s to be a consul. The fact that Marcus held this at age 19 was a way to say he was both to learn how to rule, but also to be seen as a ruler from the very beginning. Within just a few years of that, Marcus was given all of the trappings of imperial power. So in his mid-20s, Marcus married the daughter of Antoninus Pius. Her name was Faustina. And as you know from previous episodes, emperors used their daughters or sisters, the female members of their family, to connect themselves to other men, especially men who they wanted to potentially succeed them. And there was no closer female relationship than Antoninus Pius's daughter Faustina. So this action signals that Marcus is favored for succession. And Faustina, immediately when she married Marcus, was given the title Augusta, Empress. Again, yet another signal that the imperial succession was going through her to Marcus. And then Marcus, in turn, by the year 147, just a couple years after the marriage, was given the title Caesar and a permanent imperium, that is, permanent rights to command the Roman military. In addition to these formal titles, Antoninus Pius would often have Marcus right at his side whenever he showed up in public. This was an informal yet important way to again signal that Marcus was his favored son. I should also say something about the families of the two men. As I mentioned in the last episode, Antoninus Pius was loyal both to his wife who died and to Hadrian by not remarrying. The reason for this is that had Antoninus Pius remarried, he might have produced male children, which would have then threatened the succession plan of Hadrian, which required that Antoninus Pius would succeed Hadrian, and then Marcus Aurelius and another man, Lucius Verus, would then succeed Antoninus Pius. If Antoninus Pius, in the middle of that arrangement, had male children, those male children also would have had a claim to the succession, and you likely would have seen some kind of civil war or at least some sort of succession crisis of some kind. And so he stayed faithful. But through Marcus, his adoptive son, Antoninus Pius, could have grandchildren. And Marcus and Faustina immediately started producing children. The great tragedy is that many of them died. In the year 147, they had a daughter, but she would not live into her teens. In AD 149, Marcus and Faustina had twin sons. Unfortunately, both of them died in infancy. That tragedy was followed up with the birth of another daughter, who the couple named Lucilla. This child will survive and grow into adulthood, and her influence in affairs during the end of the Pax Romana is significant. So you should remember her name, Lucilla, eldest surviving daughter of Marcus and Faustina, born in March of AD 150. During the 150s, they had several other children, a son, two daughters. The son died. And then in 161, the very same year that Marcus Aurelius would become emperor, the couple gave birth to twin boys again. This time, one of them would survive. His name was Lucius Aurelius Commodus. And Commodus is probably a name you have heard as well, but we will talk about him in a future podcast. The last child born to Marcus and Faustina was another son born in 162 who also died. So Marcus and Faustina produced many children, but the vast majority of them did not survive into adulthood. This was probably a great source of sadness for the couple. Our sources are not very clear about how these children died. It could have been health issues. Certainly Marcus was not a very healthy man, at least as far as we can tell. We have letters between Marcus and his teacher, a man named Marcus Cornelius Fronto. And Fronto was a tutor to Marcus as well as his adoptive brother Lucius Verus. In AD 144, when Marcus was in his mid-20s, the future emperor wrote to Fronto about a protracted illness that afflicted him. Marcus would live a life that was generally quite concerned with health. And it's one of these unfortunate ironies of history that the world's first pandemic, the Antonine Plague, would strike the Roman Empire during the reign of Marcus Aurelius. But again, like so many other things, we'll talk about that later because it strikes when Marcus is already emperor. We're not going to get there just today. Now, I've said a lot about Marcus Aurelius, and you've seen just how much he was promoted and favored by Antoninus Pius and was really prepared to take over as emperor. But if you remember from way back when we talked about Hadrian's succession plans in episode 40, Marcus was not the only heir. The other adoptive grandson of Hadrian was Lucius Verus. And Antoninus Pius didn't change that arrangement, but he certainly favored Marcus far more than Lucius. Now, it's true, Lucius was younger than Marcus Aurelius. Lucius was like 8 or 9 or 10 or something like that when Antoninus Pius took over. So you can't give a child the consulship, for example. And when Lucius Verus became a man in AD 154, he was given the consulship. But as long as Antoninus Pius lived, he did not approve of Lucius marrying anybody. It really seems like the family line was focused on Marcus and Faustina. And so there was a little bit of a question when Antoninus Pius finally died in March of AD 161 as to whether the arrangement of Hadrian was still going to stand. Because when Antoninus Pius died, both of his successors were still alive, Marcus and Lucius, but one of them was far more prepared for rule than the other. And our sources, which do cover this moment in history pretty well, all suggest that the Senate was prepared to acknowledge Marcus alone and to leave Lucius Verus out of the succession. Had they done this, and had Marcus went along with it, would Lucius Verus have simply accepted being robbed of his birthright? Or would he have sought to build a faction and perhaps launch a civil war? Would Marcus have attempted to assassinate him? During the Pax Romana, there had only been a few times when multiple emperors made claims to rule, and those had all been moments of instability and civil war. And it probably won't surprise you to learn that not long after the death of Antoninus Pius, Rome's old enemy, the Parthian Empire, the rulers of Persia, decided to pounce on what looked to them like an inevitable civil war between Marcus and Lucius, and they decided to take the province of Armenia. The Pax Romana could very well have ended around 161. We have a foreign invasion and questions about who should rule. But we're told that Marcus himself came up with a solution to these crises. And we'll start with that on the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocor. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.